Hi everyone, in this video what I'm wanting to do is to give you a bit of a lowdown really on the Section B exam questions that I set for homework last week as part of your remote learning. Now I've already sent you out a copy of the model answers, but sometimes it's quite useful to hear me talk you through the thought process behind some of these different answers to work on that all important exam technique. So what we've got up on the flip chart here, first of all, is a 4-mark question. This was number 11 that you were set as part of your independent work last week. So we've got the question with reference to extract A and figure 1, explain how changes in the exchange rate of the pound has contributed towards UK inflation. Now it's worth noting first of all that on a question like this we're not looking for you to write lots and lots. If you get this right, a few short sentences should I say, and you'll pick up 4 marks. So what you should be thinking when you see a 4-marker is this. It's 2-2. So 2 marks for knowledge and 2 marks for application. Right, now anyway, it's worth pointing out then from the extract that what we know is when this case study was written, that inflation had increased to over 3%. What we also know is that the currency had depreciated in value. So if it's depreciated in value, what that means, the pound is now weaker than what it was previously. In other words, one UK pound will now buy less foreign currency than what it would do before. So if we were taking an example, let's keep the numbers simple. Imagine we're comparing a pound to euros. And let's imagine that a pound used to get you €1.50. Well, if it's become weaker, let's imagine it's a significant drop. Let's imagine now that £1 is equal to only €1. Now what this will mean is through this acronym WIPIDEC is weak pound, imports dear, exports cheaper. Now let's think about why it will make imports dearer first of all. Imagine we used to buy from Europe a $1.50 good. That €1.50. That €1.50 good used to cost us in the UK to buy £1. So a €1.50 good from France used to cost a British firm £1 to bring into the UK economy. So that would have been a cost to a UK business. Well, that €1.50 good now will now become more expensive than what it was before to buy. Because before, to buy a €1.50 good, we had to sacrifice £1. Well now, with our £1, we're only going to get €1. So what would now happen is that a €1.50 good would now cost a UK firm £1.50 to import into the economy. So what this will mean is that businesses that have to import things into our country from across the world, whether it be food or fuel, will now see their cost of their imports increase. Now what this will do, it will result in inward shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve. This is because business costs have increased, so if firms are now paying more to bring in essential supplies into the country, they've got to raise their prices. And in the extract it said that one cause of inflation increasing was higher food prices. So if buying imported food is now more expensive for UK supermarkets, it will result in higher prices when we walk into the shops. So that covers the imports dear. Those higher import prices would lead to SRAS moving inwards, so we've got cost push inflation. Now exports will also become cheaper, and think about why. Someone in Europe used to have to pay €1.50 to buy a £1 product from British businesses. Well, look at the difference now. To buy that £1 product at the new exchange rate, it will only cost them €1. So what this will mean is the foreign currency price of UK exports will fall. And if you remember the formula for aggregate demand, C plus I plus G plus X minus M, if exports are cheaper, we've got to assume the foreign demand for our exports will increase. And if exports increase, we're going to have an outward shift in aggregate demand. So when the currency gets weaker, because imports are now more expensive, that will create cost push inflation. If exports become cheaper and demand for them increases, well, that will lead to an outward shift in aggregate demand, and it will create demand pull inflation. Now, when you look at my answer, it's far shorter than that. If you'd gone down the cost push inflation driven by higher import prices, that can get you 4 marks. If you go down the cheaper exports, which would lead to a growth in AD and therefore create demand pull inflation, that would also get you 4 marks. So 2 for knowledge and 2 for application on that question. So to give you a really quick answer which would score 4 out of 4, we could say from the extract we can see that inflation in the UK has increased to over 3%. We also can see that the currency has depreciated in value. The weak currency will make imports such as food more expensive, and this will contribute to more cost push inflation. Right, okay everyone, now moving on a little bit. Hopefully you can see this clearly. Now, next one we've got is number 12. And number 12 states, with reference to extracts, A, explain 2 likely consequences of higher UK inflation. Now, when you see a 6 marker, what you should be thinking is 2, 2, 2. 2 for knowledge, 2 for application, and 2 marks for analysis. So on this question, what I would be looking for would be 2 short paragraphs. And each paragraph should have a knowledge, an application, and an analysis mark built into it. So you've got up on the flip chart here what I would include for paragraph 1 and what I would include for paragraph 2. So we've been doing a lot of work recently on monetary policy. And what we know is that the Bank of England in the UK are responsible for keeping inflation as close to 2% as possible. So if inflation starts to go above it, they've got to use deflationary or contractionary policies to bring AD back down to ease those inflationary pressures. Now, one thing that we might see then, if inflation starts to creep above 2%, is that we might see an increase in the rate of interest. And the extract tells us this, that interest rates have increased from 0.25 to 0.5%. Now, we've then got to explain what the consequence of those should be. Well, as interest rates start to increase, the logic will be there will be an increase in the cost of borrowing for households and firms, which should lead to less consumption and less investment taking place due to reduced willingness and ability to borrow. But also consumption should also fall due to the higher returns available for savers. So we're increasing the opportunity cost of spending money. So the logic will be, everyone, that what the higher interest rates that are likely to be brought in will do, they will bring down C and they will bring down I, and that would reduce AD to hopefully bring down the rate of inflation across the economy. So if I was to put that into a small paragraph, I could say one consequence could be higher interest rates. So for example, from the extract we can see interest rates in the UK have increased from 0.25% to 0.5%. This would reduce the this would raise the cost of borrowing and also raise the returns available for savers. This should therefore deter both consumption and investment and reduce aggregate demand in the economy. Now, a second one we could go for is this one here. When you tend to have high inflation, you would generally assume that it would have a bigger impact on poorer households than what it would do richer households. And a logical, simple way of thinking about it is your lowest income households in our country, in any country across the world, will consume probably 100% of their income. So because income's so low, by the time they've bought all their essential needs, there is no money left over. So it means that poorer households haven't got that ability to save. So if inflation's to increase, it means their real wages will now start to go down. And that will mean that these lower income households will now find it more difficult to pay for basic essentials. That could plunge more low income households into higher debt as they borrow more to maintain living standards. Or it could just mean that these people will see their living standards fall. And in the extract it does say that those on low fixed incomes are now struggling because of the inflation. And think about it logically, if we've got higher food prices or higher fuel prices, it means that those people that don't earn a lot of money will struggle now to afford food and energy. Richer households, all they will do is save slightly less than what they were doing before to maintain their living standards. So what we might see because of inflation is a growth in poverty. So those on lower incomes start to struggle, and that could bring down living standards for lots and lots of different people. Right everyone, so like I say, number 12, what I'll be looking for will be 2 relatively short paragraphs, and if you look at my model answers, it will give you a breakdown of how I've answered those questions there. Right everyone, now the last one on this page, hopefully you can see that, is number 13. And what this one says is, with reference to extract A and figure 2, explain one reason why we update the basket of goods and services. Now this question was all about the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. Now it's worth just sort of recapping really briefly on what this is. The Consumer Price Index, well, it's an index, and what we're doing here, we will regularly survey households to find out people's buying habits. So the products that households generally spend the bulk of their money on, what percent goes on particular goods and services, and how these trends and tastes and fashions change over time. And what we can therefore calculate from that CPI, or that Consumer Price Index, is the rate of inflation. So we can measure from the CPI how people's costs of living are changing over time. And then that is used to measure not just inflation across the economy, but how much wage rates need to increase by, how much businesses often raise prices by across the country. So it's a really, really important thing to measure. Now what we've got to make sure that we do is that when we measure the cost of living, that we are as accurate as possible. So what we don't want to include in that basket of goods are products that people don't generally buy. So for example, if we're looking over quite a long period of time, think about how people's tastes and fashions and how technology changes what we buy. When I was a kid, you would go down to the video shop to rent a video on a Friday night as a Friday night treat. Well, as technology has progressed and changed, kids today don't do that. They would watch Netflix or Amazon Prime or Disney Plus instead. So what we would do, we would update the basket of goods to reflect those changes. We no longer care about the average rental price of a video from Blockbuster. Well, one, because you can't do it anymore, but two, because people don't do it anymore, it's not an accurate thing to include in that basket of goods and services. So what we must do is to update that basket of goods and services to reflect the buying habits of households. So if I was looking in the extracts, it clearly says there's been a shift in what people are buying. There's been a big shift towards health and fitness products. There's been a big growth in demand for non-dairy milk. That could be things like almond milk, etc. Well, if these things are becoming more popular, these things should be included in that basket of goods and services. They've taken out apple cider. Well, if people aren't drinking apple cider in as big quantities as they used to, then we've got to make sure that the basket of goods represents that. So we might take it out, or at the very least we'd reduce the weighting of certain products. So if I were looking for an answer here on this question, I'd be thinking 1, 2, 2. So 1 for knowledge, 2 for application, and 2 for analysis. So the knowledge mark, the 1, would be given for the reason. So if I was to say that it's got to be up to date to accurately measure the cost of living, or to calculate accurate inflation rates, that knowledge, I've then got to think about the application. So I could include the fact that there's been a big growth in demand for health and fitness products or non-dairy milk. Therefore, these things are now included in the basket of goods and services. I could go down the line that we've taken out some products like apple cider due to their decline in popularity. And the analysis marks for explaining why this will mean we've got to update the basket of goods and services. So logically, if people are now spending, let's say, 10% of their income on health and fitness products, well, they should be a key component of that basket of goods and services. Right, everyone, 2 more questions to go. Let's remove that one. And I'll go back to the top of the page a little bit. Right, now number 14 was a 10 marker. So with reference to figure 3, assess the impact of the change in exports on economic growth. Use aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagrams. Now, I think this question, it should be relatively straightforward to pick up at least 6 out of 10. But again, a really, really good start here is to think about that word there, assess. Now, as soon as I see the word assess, it's developed beyond things like explain or analyse. That is now wanting me to evaluate. So on a 10 marker, I need to be thinking this. 2, 2, 2, 4. 2 marks for knowledge, 2 for application, 2 for analysis, and 4 for evaluation. Now, if I was going through my answer for this question, then I've got to get across, well, what is the change in exports? Well, from the extract, we can see that exports have increased from £45 billion per month to £50 billion per month. And that has been driven largely by the weaker currency. Remember, the logic would be whippy deck. Weak pound, imports dear, exports cheap. If our exports are now cheaper across the world to buy, it means the UK has gained international competitiveness. So export demand should increase. Now, what I would now do is to include my diagram. Now, I've put here the formula for aggregate demand. Now, the logic would be that if we've got a growth in demand for exports, then it would lead to an outward shift in aggregate demand. So I can now go for either a Keynesian LRAS curve, or I can go for a classical sort of diagram that differentiates between short run and long run aggregate supply. I could include the LRAS for 1 to 2, it doesn't really matter. So what I've got, everyone, in both diagrams is the outward shift in aggregate demand. So what I would do, I would get my knowledge and application marks for saying, well, overall, we've got a growth in exports of £5 billion per month, partly driven by the weaker currency. This would lead to an outward shift in AD as shown by my diagram. Now, for the analysis marks, I've got to be thinking about this. How will it impact on economic growth? Well, look at the diagram. It shows a growth in output. Well, that's actual economic growth. So all I've now got to explain to the examiner that is, when there's a growth in demand for UK goods and services, it could mean that the economy is experiencing export-led growth. If there's a growth in demand for UK goods and services, well, that export acts as an injection into our economy, and it means that UK firms have now got to wrap up production to meet that growing demand, and that would lead to AD moving outwards. I could go into more detail and think about how this could lead to multiplier effects, how it could create more jobs. That could lead to growing household incomes and lead to more consumption, how it could improve animal spirits and encourage more firms to invest due to higher profits. I could do, and that would add to my analysis marks. So if I was thinking about the knowledge, application and analysis marks for this paragraph, what I would be saying is, well, overall, exports have increased from £45 billion to £50 billion per month. This has been driven by the weaker currency, which will lead to an increase in UK international competitiveness. I could then say that as exports increase, there will be an outward shift in aggregate demand. As AD moves outwards, it means that UK firms have to respond by increasing output. This will therefore signal actual economic growth, as shown in the diagram. This will then lead to higher profits for firms, which may incentivise more investment. It will create more job opportunities, which could lead to growth in incomes, and these could lead to further growths or outward shifts in aggregate demand due to the multiplier effect. I've then got to think about evaluation though. So what I'm looking at with evaluation is not necessarily why it won't have this impact. I'm trying to take the shine off it a little bit. Well, to what extent would it have these impacts? Will it have a big impact? Will it have a small impact? So I'm going to be thinking about this word here, magnitude. We're looking at the size of the impact here. Now, You've been doing a lot of work for me recently looking at data about how big the UK economy is. We are roughly a £2 trillion economy. So £5 billion extra exports per year is a very minimal impact on our economy. Sorry, £5 billion per month. It's not a very big impact on UK GDP. What we could say is that exports are a very small component of aggregate demand. So although the growth in exports is a good thing for the UK aggregate demand and output, there's probably more important components of aggregate demand that we'd like to see increase. So in the UK, for example, consumption is by far the biggest component of aggregate demand. So a growth in exports might be really, really good, but the magnitude of that growth is probably going to be quite limited. So I'm getting across that £5 billion a month extra is very minimal given the size of our economy. Right, everyone, now the last question, it was the toughest one. It was a 15 marker. With reference to figure 4 in extract B, discuss the limitations of GDP data to compare living standards between developed countries such as the UK and developing economies. Now on a 15 marker, this is what you should be thinking. It's 3, 3, 3, 6. 3 for knowledge, 3 for application, 3 for analysis, and 6 marks for evaluation. Now let's leave the evaluation off this for a moment or two and think about this. Now, first of all, GDP data. What GDP does, it shows us the value of the output produced by the citizens of an economy. Living standards is measuring people's ability to satisfy wants and needs. Now, many economists would argue, and the data does generally hold up for this, that what we can do with GDP, we can use it to calculate GDP per capita. So that would give us roughly the average amount of output accessible to each person within an economy in a year. And the logic would be that the higher the GDP per capita, the better the living standards would be in that particular country. Let's now think about these words, developed and developing countries. We're going to be looking a lot of this into theme 4. A developed economy is an economy like the UK with high incomes, good access to education and healthcare. So what we would generally say is in a developed economy like the UK, living standards should be quite high. Developing economies, well, these are the ones that you would generally find in big parts of Africa, bits of South America, Central America, even some East European economies, Asian economies, or lots of them anyway, should I say. So here you would expect lower living standards, so lower incomes, poorer access to education, healthcare, housing, etc. Now let's imagine we had a country A, which was a developed economy, and we found out their GDP per capita was $43,000 per person per year. Country B, let's say it's only $8,000 per person per year. Now what we would generally assume is looking at that data then is that people in country A will have a much better living standard than the people in country B. Well, there's a big problem with that GDP data, is that we've got to be thinking about this. What do we produce? How do we produce? And for whom do we produce? So GDP overall is just a crude measurement of the value of output produced in the country. We've got to be looking at what is produced. Are we producing things that improve living standards? Are we, for example, producing good access to food and healthcare and education and housing? The things that really, really correlate with living standards. Or are we producing defence technology, junk food, demerit goods, things that create negative externalities, the things that don't necessarily correlate with better living standards? So we could argue that GDP on its own is too crude. It tells very little about what is produced within an economy. So it might not be a useful way of measuring living standards in a country. How we produce, we don't know how much pollution or what environmental damage has been created by the production of those goods and services. We don't, for example, know whether we're using slavery or very immoral practice for producing goods and services. So again, it can distort how we produce. Now, this is sort of building up onto my first point here, inequality. We don't know for whom output is produced in a country. What we know is, in most countries across the world, there'll be a fairly significant gap in incomes between rich and low-income households. So, for example, in country A, even though the incomes might be very, very high on average, this data could be distorted massively by a very small number of very, very wealthy people in the country. So what we cannot do is to assume that everyone has got that kind of income coming in. It's an average that could be sucked up by the very, very wealthy in a country. Now, if we're thinking about developing countries, we're also going to be thinking about the informal economy. In developing economies, well, in rich countries too, we can only really measure GDP by recorded output. So when output is exchanged between different households, what we'd like to is to assume that we're recording that transaction somewhere, which will then go towards GDP data. Well, in developing economies in particular, they tend to have a very, very big informal sector. So they have a high proportion of people that are employed in work that is unofficial work. This could be agricultural work, it could be service sector based work where people are paid cash in hand. Now these people then, their income that they earn will contribute towards their living standards, but because it's not recorded in the country GDP statistics, it could undervalue the actual GDP per capita available in those economies. So if I was thinking about this question then, it does say discuss the limitations. It's wanting more than one. So I've got to go with two. So I would go with inequality. So GDP data will distort gaps between rich and poor people in different countries across the world. It's therefore not particularly a very effective way of measuring living standards. We would also argue the informal economy, if it's large, again will distort GDP data and not give us a true representation of what living standards are like in that particular economy. I think it's also worth noting though as well that a big significant problem is that living standard is a very, very subjective thing. We don't, for example, necessarily know that GDP data will always correlate with better living standards. For some people, money is not the be-all and end-all. It could be down to leisure time or the quality, the atmosphere, the environment, friendships with neighbours, etc. and family could be seen as more important. But if I was evaluating for these final 6 marks, these things are really, really important. One useful thing about GDP data is that it's available. Measuring living standards by looking at things like life expectancy, access to education, healthcare, it might be more useful, but it's very, very difficult data to get, especially in developing economies. But what we have got for every country in the world is really, really easily accessible GDP data. So it might not be perfect for measuring living standards, but it's one of the few bits of data we've got across the world that is accessible and easy to obtain. We've also got to consider as well that GDP per capita will correlate with living standards. So what we would assume is that if GDP per capita is higher within that economy, we would generally expect to see better access to shelter, other essential needs like healthcare, education and food, the ability to save for retirement. So we would expect to see that as GDP data improves, we should expect better living standards, because the things that matter for a lot of people will correlate with GDP data. So everyone, what I'll be looking for on this question will probably be a 5-paragraph answer. Paragraph 1 would be knowledge. Get across what GDP is, what living standards are. Paragraph 2 would be a problem of using this to make these comparisons. And then I would expect in paragraph 3 a counterbalance. Paragraph 4 would be a second limitation. And then finally paragraph 5 would be the second limitation. Right guys, there you go. Hopefully that's useful. Like I say, developing exam skills is such an important thing to get right. So hopefully you found that useful, and I'll stop there. Thank you very much.